Yeah.
Thank you, Taiwo Owatemi, for joining the Voice interview. You're recently appointed to the front bench as an equalities spokesperson for Labour. Can I just start by getting your thoughts on how Black communities have fared in this pandemic? Because we've seen some statistics, Black businesses being twice as likely to close, BME unemployment rising 3 times as fast as white unemployment during the pandemic, and with COVID deaths, African men are up to 4 times more likely to die of COVID. So what's your analysis about the way that the government has or hasn't responded to this?
And just to break down some of the points that you've just said there, Lester, as a member of the Health and Social Care Committee, a lot of my work has been looking at just the impact of COVID on the BME community, and we've all seen just how much it's impacted the community in terms of just the death rates, but also just highlights the health inequality that exists, particularly in areas in which are predominantly populated by people from the BAME background. And this just highlights just what we have to do to address some of the inequalities that we have in our society. So, for example, the housing crisis, which has meant that many families who live in intergenerational households were more likely to bring COVID home from work or just from general being outside in the communities and schools. It also highlighted just the health inequalities in those areas in terms of the fact that within certain populations are more likely to have cardiovascular diseases, asthma, diabetes, healthcare conditions in which that needs really that face-to-face and that monitoring from GP healthcare, which we didn't see right now during COVID. It wasn't surprising, but it was very disheartening actually just to see the challenges that healthcare workers, particularly both men and women, had to face in terms of, number one, being able to get the appropriate PPE, given the fact that they were created predominantly for, so for example, many of the Filipino women complained about how it was essentially created for 6'1" white males, and which was a different completely body frame from them, but also the fact that, and I know that's something that even my own mum had to go through, which was the fact that many BAME professionals were being put on the front line, giving those extra shifts, despite their health risk factors, despite the fact that they might have high blood pressure or diabetes, and knowingly putting them at risk, even though reports were coming in about death rates. And that really shows the need and the change in culture within certain workplaces, particularly within the NHS, and just in terms of how healthcare workers and BAME healthcare workers are treated. And that leads me to my second point, and the point that you made about employment. When we look at certain institutions like the NHS, we see that, for example, only 3% of Black women or BAME women are on the board of or are chief nurses. Well, when you look at the NHS, you will see that actually there's a lot of diversity there. So why is it that we don't have that diversity representation? But then even during the pandemic, many businesses and many small owners really suffered, and many of them had to shut their doors due to the fact that we were all in lockdown, or due to the changes that had to happen. And when I and Annalise went speaking to businesses, the one thing that we kept hearing about from businesses was that, first of all, they weren't always aware about how to access the government loans. Secondly, they had difficulties in being able to access it, and actually it was quite challenging for them. And again, that lack of support, that lack of understanding of how to navigate through the system just highlights the need for leadership and mentorship within the entrepreneur space and small businesses, which really needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Has the Tony Sewell report taken things backwards?
Pardon? Sorry.
Has the Tony Sewell report taken us backwards?
Oh, I would say that there's a lot to be done, and it's disappointing the lack of progress that we've been able to make.
Because it didn't even address the issue of systemic racism, which is obviously a phrase that Labour are using, and seriously downplayed to the extent of denying institutional racism. So that's why I'm wondering, because Labour's position is that systemic racism exists. The Sewell report, you can surmise that they don't think it exists. So surely that's taking things backwards.
Like I said, I think that report just shows just how much work there needs to be done in terms of the fact that the government thought that they could play politics essentially with so many people's lives, but also that they saw this as some form of cultural war, which was really disappointing, given the fact that, you know, so many black people, so many minorities worked really hard during the COVID, has contributed so much to this country. And just to dismiss the feelings within the population and just to essentially gaslight the black community and ethnic minority communities that are concerns and the struggles we've gone through, for example, with pay and with workplace practices, did not exist. And that was very disappointing for so many people and very heartbreaking. And it was shocking because for many people who are having those conversations with their employers, especially after George Floyd, and many companies who are trying to really understand and learn how they can change their practices, you're right, I guess to a certain extent that kind of was providing a justification to them that they didn't need to go through that development process which they're already going in, and to be honest, that just wasn't needed. But also the public were at a point where they were willing, and where they were asking questions and they wanted to be educated, they wanted to be supported, and that kind of report actually does not help. Doesn't help to achieve what we've all been trying to get at. But fundamentally, it was very disappointing to think that the government thought that was the best approach to be addressing something so important to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think a lot of people would agree with you on that. What's your attitude towards heads of institutions that deny that institutional racism is an issue where they are?
Saddened, actually, really saddened that they fail to, number one, understand their own institution and the challenges that their workers have to go through. But secondly, it highlights their understanding and their exposure to the difficulties that people are facing in our society, and the fact that actually, and it actually shows that they need more training as well, given the fact that there is just some things that people think are acceptable, but actually it's what us as minorities have had to deal with over the years, you know, things like, oh, your food smells, or can I touch your hair? Just small difficulties that really make it very challenging for people in the workplaces, but we've had to endure. And I think the organisations really have to, and those CEOs and those leaders have to look at their form of leadership. Number one, they have to go back and speak to their staff and know exactly what experiences and challenges their staff are going through and really review and how they plan to address those issues. But they also have to understand that they don't have the ability to really make such a definite conclusion without speaking to the people who are affected within their organisation. And I think it's disappointing that they felt that they could do that.
Well, of course, one of those people is Cressida Dick, who's head of the Metropolitan Police, that has stop and search disparities, as the Met has always had. But just like to turn into Labour for a minute, I mean, Keir Starmer's committed to abolishing 0 hours contracts, and we know that black people are twice as likely to be on such contracts, but black people are also twice as likely to be on temporary contracts. There's a big issue, as I'm sure you know, with disproportionality, you know, in terms of casualisation as well. So, you know, what's Labour's plan for tackling these issues?
Okay, Starmer and I guess the Women's and Equality team have always been dedicated to looking at ensuring that we have an ethnicity pay review to ensure that we address some of the disparities between ethnicities, and that's something that actually I'm currently looking at and will be leading the way on that. But also we are dedicated to the equalities or the racial equalities review. And it's something that, you know, I've only been in this job for a couple of weeks, but it's something at the forefront of my agenda. And there are certain aspects, particularly within the review, which I am particularly passionate about from my own experience, and then I'll be pushing for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I do appreciate you only been in the role for a very, very short period of time. But Keir Starmer mentioned, you know, in his recent very wordy essay that, you know, he's committed to a Race Equality Act. And of course, that was an idea that came out of Doreen Lawrence's report, which was came out in April. So I'm sure, you know, before your time as well in the role, there's been some thinking about what should be in such an act. So what do you think should be in such an act?
Well, I'm actually leading on that particularly, and there's so much within that act. But the areas which I'm currently looking at, there are three main areas, which I guess one is the ethnicity pay gap, which I've spoken about. Secondly is looking at our schools and exclusion rates, given the fact that we know that, you know, black people, particularly black boys, are more likely to be excluded, and that affects their ability to be successful later on in life, just based on the stigma that comes with exclusion, but also the challenges that happen later on. Thirdly, I'm going to be looking at institutions like looking at workplace practices and looking at what we can do to address the inequalities within workplace practices, and that's why I gave the example that, for example, we only have 3% of nurses within our NHS who are black, and that's a shock given the fact that actually when you look at the NMC, just the amount of the black women inside the NHS, that shouldn't be the case. And I've been speaking to the National Midwifery Council, I've been speaking to the Nursing Council as well, just to understand what we can do, but also looking at workplace cultures. So for example, and it's particularly women, but given the fact that the NHS has so many women and so many people, like you said, on 0-hour contracts, what active steps can be done in terms of childcare arrangement, in terms of flexibility in workplaces, so that we're able to get a more diverse workforce, but also so that we're actually addressing some of the challenges that stops people, particularly minorities, from being able to progress in such workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any plans to bring the private sector fully under the Equality Act? So, for example, to be subject to positive duties?
In terms of the private sector as well?
In terms of the private sector?
Currently, like I said, I am very new to this and I'm looking to this, but for my own particular vision, I'm looking at the private sector as well.
Okay, yeah. So would that include, for example, raising the bar in terms of companies meeting certain criteria on racial diversity on procurement? Because in order to get public contracts, the public authorities can set the bar to a certain extent. So this is a tool that governments, local, regional, national, can actually use to make sure that those private companies that are taking the public shilling adhere to certain standards.
Well, that would be something I'll be looking at. In terms of commenting on that right now, I would have to come back and give you more details, but it's something I'll certainly be looking at.
Okay, absolutely. And I noticed that the last Race and Faith Manifesto had the goal of eliminating racial disparities in employment. Obviously, that's a big promise, but is that something that Labour still stands by?
Yeah, we haven't changed. We haven't changed from an equality point of view in terms of any of our policies. So the answer to that is yes.
Absolutely. Okay. And also, just in terms of just the one more on the sort of technical side of things. At the moment, public authorities, can pick from protected characteristics, like which two they focus on in terms of the positive duty, and this has led, as I'm sure you know, to accusations that we really have a hierarchy of equalities. Can Labour guarantee that race will always be on the agenda?
Well, as a woman of colour, I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah, I can't even, yes, because it's something that I'm passionate about. And, when we talk about race, it's not statistics. This is an everyday occurrence to me and to so many within my office and within my own personal circle. And it's why, this is a role that I really want to make a difference in, because my vision, and Claire's aware of this, and Annalise is aware of this, is about really looking back at the next generation, also my generation, and also looking at my mum's generation and older people, making sure that they look at Britain and they feel comfortable and they feel as if they are accepted within the country, and also that this is all our homes. So I want Britain to be the best place to grow up in and to grow old in for everyone, regardless of their race. So yes, we will be looking at that, and I don't see why Labour's vision should ever change on that. It has always been a priority in which we've been dedicated to.
Should the statues of slave traders come down?
The statues, in terms of the ones, for example, well, both within
Well, we have a situation at the moment where some statues, have come down. Obviously, one was done in the harbour, which we know about. There was in Colston, but there's been one or two where the local people, don't seem to want the statue to come down. I don't know how that's going to go down with black people in the area. What happens next in those situations, or whether it actually just should be up to local people to decide. Whether they want the statue to come down or not. clearly there was some controversy about the process that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is embarking on in relation to a review of statues, etc. And that's actually caused some debate, as you know, where some people say actually they should all come down. Others actually say no, this is all unnecessary. This is just an unnecessary preoccupation, and that they should stay up.
I think just particularly because I know this has been debated quite a lot over the past year. I think when we look at these statues, obviously some of them have a very difficult historical history, and obviously for many of us that can really elicit difficult emotions and conversations, and I think that it's really fundamental that as we look at statues, that we have to be able to also, I think we have to ensure that some of these statues have a really strong historical past, and I think that as some of them are decommissioned or their necessary new homes are found, that it's important that as this process is taking place, that we don't use that as a way of I think we have to be careful. I'm thinking of the context in terms of the fact that some of this, when I think about this debate, some of these statues are very concerning. They're not necessarily statues in which we have to celebrate just based on the difficulties, but I also think it's important that as we aim to teach the next generation, that we are able to either keep them within museums or put them in places where people understand history and the context around them. So it's not necessarily about celebrating them, but it's not necessarily about celebrating them, but it's about ensuring that because what I don't want us is to get to a point where, for example, where the government can say, oh, slavery racism doesn't exist in this country because we've got rid of all the statues. There has to be, it's about how are we going to ensure that actually that we don't celebrate people who have necessarily have made lives difficult for, I guess, black people, also people within our community, but that people understand those histories so that they don't reoccur again. Yeah. But also people understand how we've been able to, why we're so diverse as a country, why the Commonwealth exists, why certain races are more predominant in this country than others, so that as we move forward as society, we understand that we are united together as a country, and that's why, for me, it's rather difficult in terms of the fact that it's about looking at those statues and seeing what can we put them in the right context in terms of museums, and how do we ensure that those stories are told as they are, rather than.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And obviously it's related to the wider point, isn't it? It's about the telling of the true history of Britain, which clearly relates to the issue about curriculum, making sure that curriculum is properly diverse, not just in terms of the optional bit, but actually the mandatory bit. Might have a view on that. But just like a related issue to statues, which is obviously also about reparations. Should Britain pay reparations?
Lester, I'm loving the questions that you are asking today, honestly.
A lot of people are asking these questions. And John McDonnell committed himself to it. So your former Shadow Chancellor said, Britain will pay reparations. Are
you asking for my view, or are you asking for Labour's view? Because
you can pick whichever one you like, really. Whichever hat that you
I think that, in terms of reparation, that's probably, just thinking realistically how it's going to be done, it probably has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But I do think that it's something that we have to look into, and it's something. But in terms of being able to commit to it, that is a conversation that, given the fact that I'm new, that I would have to just ensure, and I don't think nothing has changed, that is still within our commitments within the Treasury team. But I personally believe that it has to be case by case reviewed, but also there has to be that recognition of the
There's only one
challenges.
case. There's only one case, isn't there? There's one period of enslavement which started on a certain date and ended on a certain date. I'm not quite sure what you mean by case basis, really.
So you're talking about reparation in terms of, I'm just thinking about in terms of practicality, in terms of families wanting it, countries wanting it.
Oh, in terms of individual sort of claims.
Yes. Yes.
Obviously, there would need to be a framework, in order for.
So are you referring to the Windrush cycle? Or are you referring to
reparations for enslavement?
For enslavement, yes.
Yeah.
But that particularly, if countries wanted reparation, that would be done on a case-by-case basis, wouldn't it?
Well, it depends. I mean,
I think
if you're talking about people who've actually suffered the legacy of enslavement, they're black people in Britain are not a country. So, if reparations.
So you're talking about families.
Well, I mean, there is a question about how.
Yes.
If you had reparations, what form that would actually take, and obviously there's lots of different forms. There's reparations to the descendants of enslaved people. There's international terms of trade. There's I mean, in America, you've got people who have, or companies have set up scholarships, etc., for black people as a result, of trying to address the legacy of enslavement. So there's a whole variety of different ways, and clearly we haven't quite reached any.
So I think I must have misunderstood your question in terms of reparation. I thought you meant, for example, the statues being returned and those some point. In terms of, pardon?
No.
Oh no. But I think in terms of, just for an explanation and the point that you've raised, I think it's really important that we evaluate the harm that's been done from slavery, but also we look at the way that Britain as a society has profited from it. And I do think that, again, from my own personal point of view, I do think that we need to have a discussion about what do we do to further support, I guess, black people, given the fact that we are the people who have predominantly, in which the country has predominantly profited from. So in terms of reparation, yes. But I would have to, from a policy point of view, there has to be a discussion into how that reparation will look like. And that is something that unfortunately I can't currently comment on. But for example, I like the idea in terms of having a scholarship fund, in terms of providing with more dedicated opportunities. But that's my personal point of view.
Labour could actually set up some kind of working group to look at it, which is a possibility. But,
yes, but now that you've raised it, I will look into that and have that discussion. Okay. So thank you for raising that.
Cool. Well, just something I think was more close to the end, but looking at the Labour Party itself, the Ford report was set up after leaked WhatsApp messages from party staff. It included what's been called racially motivated abuse of your colleagues Diane Abbott, Clive Lewis, and Dawn Butler. The report was due out last year and then earlier this year. Is it time it came out?
Are you talking about the independent?
The Ford report, yeah, the independent
Ford report.
Yes.
I think every member, including Annalise, can say that it's time for the Ford report to come out. But the Ford report is an independent report, and currently we are waiting for the necessary process and for the report to be published. But this is not something in which the Labour Party has pretty much any control in, because we wanted it to be independent, because we wanted to ensure that there was no way that we'll be able to, in any circumstances, determine the outcome of that report. So currently we are waiting for it, and honestly it's a source of discussion every single time we do meet up, but we are currently waiting for it to be.
Well, I guess one of the things that is at stake here is whether this is actually going to affect the relationship, if you like, between the Labour Party and black members, because some black members have been expressing some concern about it. So I think there is that relationship issue really to make sure that black members are fully happy with the state of affairs within the Labour Party in terms of internally.
From what I understand, there has been a push to ensure the report should be available earlier next year. But like I said, it's an independent report. And you are right. I have that those discussions in my CLP, and I've even asked before becoming shadow minister in terms of what in the world is happening to this report and why is it taking so long. And again, the difficulty is that it's an independent report, that we cannot control how when it's going to be published. But I know the discussions are being had to ask and to plead for that report to be published as early as possible.
Absolutely, that's very clear.
I agree with you. It's really hard because the Labour Party does not take black people for granted. We're working very hard. It's the reason why the report was commissioned, to address some of the failings and how to improve it. But it is very disappointing that it's taken so long for the report to come out.
Yeah, and I suppose you've really sort of touched on what's supposed to be my final question, really, which is actually about the extent to which black votes matter, as much as, for example, red wall votes. There has been some accusations, if you like, that the focus at the moment of the Labour Party is really on winning back those red wall seats, perhaps to the exclusion of safe Labour seats in inner city sort of areas, really. So I mean, can you reassure our voters, if you like, that the interests of black voters in safe Labour seats is equal to that of northern red wall seats?
Absolutely, it is equal to that. And as Shadow Minister for Women's and Equality, we are looking at all areas of intersectionality as well. But also, I think there's that misconception that there isn't black voters in those red wall seats. I represent one of those red wall seats, and I have black voters in my constituency, and their issues are of great importance to me, and it's something that I take of great priority. So without a doubt, Labour is dedicated and is committed to looking at black voters and looking at all voters, regardless of where they are in the country. Yeah. We're not neglecting anyone, and that's something that it's something that I'm taking very seriously, and I know Annalise is too as well.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Finally, the Commonwealth Games will be in Birmingham.
Yes, it would be.
It's not very far from your constituency.
No, it doesn't.
Coventry, that's sort of down the road slightly. What do you hope this will bring to the black community of the West Midlands?
Commonwealth Game is all about showing culture and looking at some of I guess our diversity, and I think that the Commonwealth Game in Birmingham particularly is important in terms of showing the diversity that exists within Birmingham. And I'm hoping that this will allow many cultural organisations and many black community groups to be able to get involved and showcase the talent, but also their positive contributions in which they've made to Birmingham, but not only Birmingham, to the whole of the West Midlands. And I think that it helps to showcase and change the narrative, because I think sometimes people, like you've spoken about earlier, people always think that diversity in England is predominantly London, and people really don't know about the great history, particularly the positive contributions that those from the Caribbean background has made in cities such as Birmingham and in cities such as my own city of Coventry. So I'm really hoping that the Commonwealth Game provides that opportunity, but also a legacy in terms of providing more community support for charities, but also businesses within the area, particularly owned by black people that would need that extra support. And I hope that, and I am asking for the Commonwealth Game to be as inclusive as possible. I know that's something that we're looking at in Coventry since this year. We are celebrating a city of culture. One of our main aims is to ensure that all the diverse groups in Coventry are represented. Everyone has made a positive contribution to the Games, but also everyone has benefited from it. And I really do hope, and I have spoken to the Commonwealth, that that this is a great opportunity for us to showcase the brilliant diversity that we have here in the West Midlands.
Taiwo, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.